My guest this week is Wendy Francis. Wendy is the Queensland and Northern Territory Director of the Australian Christian Lobby. Wendy is also the ACL spokesperson for the rights of children and women and has been a strong campaigner against sexual exploitation in all its forms. Her husband, Peter Francis, is Vice Principal of Malyon College in Brisbane, and they have been married for 37 years and have 3 married children and 10 grandchildren. Wendy's professional experience includes managerial positions at Griffith University and Queensland Baptists. In 2012, she contributed to the book The Greens Policies, Reality and Consequences, published by Connor Court. Wendy is also a director and board member of Samaritan's Purse Australia, the Queensland Family Council, the Queensland Alliance for Kids and the Australian Marriage Forum. Wendy regularly travels to countries such as Vietnam, Thailand, Bangladesh and Cambodia to oversee projects which seek to rescue women and children from sex slavery and to work on literacy projects amongst rural women. Wendy Francis, welcome to Church and State.
Thanks for having me, Dave. It's good to be here.
Now, I enjoy a great deal of latitude and freedom being an independent commentator, but as a representative of the Australian Christian Lobby, your job is to actually lobby all sides of government, both sides of the political spectrum. And so you have to maintain a bit of tension with being friendly and yet honest with them as well. Tell me exactly how that works.
Absolutely. I think for me, one of the mantras that I have for my own personal life is speaking truth in love. And so I find that tension quite easy to navigate. For me, truth, there is a truth. And yet that truth, if it's not spoken in love, then is like the sounding gong. And so I want to be very sure of what I'm saying. It's not that I'm always right. I don't believe that anyone is always right. But I go with facts. I go with good research. The Australian Christian Lobby are very strong on good, robust research. And I go and speak to, as you say, MPs across all spectrums of the political scene. And so I find the doors are open because they want to hear from what the Christian constituency is thinking and what they're saying. They want to because they recognise that it's a very large part of their constituency. And so it's important that they hear. And so I go, I discuss, I listen to them as well. I think it's really important that we listen. And I find that there's sometimes agreement in places that I wouldn't necessarily expect agreement. Really?
I'm very curious what the reception is like from people that should recognise they're ideologically opposite. I would expect and predict a posture that's in itself predicting there's not going to be any agreement. And it's interesting to know how that kind of conversation would work. For example, I don't know if there would be many things Bob Brown and I would agree on.
Okay, so here in Queensland, the things that I would agree on with the Greens would be, I'm very concerned about the casino going in Brisbane. I'm disappointed that public land is being used for something that only a very small minority of people will use and will also cause great family breakdown with problem gambling. The number of pokies that are planned to go into that casino in Brisbane are just devastating, really, for the city. Not bringing any good. And so I would agree with the Greens with that. And I meet with them and talk to them about how we can best lobby government to actually pull back. I'm not sure that we can actually stop the casino going ahead now. It's too far down the track. But I never believe that it's too late to do something, and I believe that we can actually pull back on how many pokies are allowed to go in there, and also pull back on how much land is actually taken and how much land should be left still for the public. This is public-owned land, and so the public. We've seen what we've done with South Bank. We should be replicating something on the other side of the river. So I agree with them on that. I've spoken to them about the Acacia Ridge. There was a hotel in Acacia Ridge wanting to include adult entertainment. The Brisbane City Council, Greens councillor, Jonathan Sree, was very helpful with that. And also so there was the greyhound racing track wanting to go ahead in Logan. Again, with that, I was able to speak across all parties and had some agreement with the Greens. At the same time, I think that we've got to never be taken in and say, okay, well, we agree, and so we're all happy and friendly, because the Greens are very strongly opposed to my position on abortion, for instance, strongly opposed to my position about marriage. But I find that I can speak to people, and I can speak my mind, I can reason with people, I can debate with people, and I can leave the room shaking hands and agreeing to disagree. I think we have to be prepared to do that. But I don't want to ever compromise on truth.
And how... I get that everybody's different, and you are going to find some leftists. In fact, I'd define a leftist separate from a liberal left person by the degree of interest that they have in anybody else's opinion in being part of the conversation. So those people aside, or even a comment, how common is it that they might completely dismiss your arguments and not even entertain interest in the facts and evidence in things where there's an ideological opposition to where you're coming from?
So I personally find that where that complete disagreement and disability to discuss happens is on social media, places like that. So on platforms like that, it's just a complete, sometimes quite abusive. But if I meet people face to face, then I think that personal contact, and I encourage other people to do the same. Meet people, talk to them face to face. And what you find is that there are always points of agreement. What's important to me is there are a priority for me. What really is a priority for me, particularly in voting, for instance. So in voting, for me, priority would be put on human life, the sanctity of all life. A priority for me when I'm looking to vote would be on where does this MP stand on marriage. And so I would be unlikely, it would be impossible for me to vote for somebody who didn't agree with my position on marriage or the sanctity of life. But it doesn't mean that we don't agree on some issues. And I do find face-to-face, there are very few people that I can't actually have a reasonable conversation with. But social media, it can get pretty ugly. I don't get ugly personally myself, but yeah.
That's interesting. Do you actually feel like you make any ground when face-to-face with people who are just ideologically defiant of, let's say, your life and marriage values?
I do. I find I make ground on a couple of levels. So I do find that I make ground on a lobbying level, because I think that they realise, hang on, this is a reasonable person with a reasonable level of understanding of this situation, and her views are different than mine, but perhaps they matter. So I do think that from a lobbying point of view. But I also really believe that personally as a Christian, these people might never have met somebody of my faith. And so as a Christian, I want to be Jesus, and I want to actually be a good example and a good witness of my faith as well. So I find that lobbying is very important face to face, but for a Christian, I also believe that it's important that we are salt and light, and that means getting out there and actually meeting with people who don't necessarily agree with us. We will learn things, and hopefully they will learn things as well.
Yeah, definitely. You've partly answered one of the questions I have for you, but maybe you can shed some more light or expound in more detail. Some people will determine their vote at a coming election by how their parents always voted, and they're just, our family always votes for party X.
Yeah.
Or they may just have their own personal tradition, and I always, I'm even a member of this party, so I'm always going to vote for party Y. More and more these days, we're seeing people voting on the personal appearance of a candidate, the personality of a candidate, and some people even base their vote on the religious or ideological appeal. Oh, this person's a Christian, so I'm going to vote for them, without even thinking about their actual policies or their actual voting intentions on any specific important legislation. As the Australian Christian Lobby, how do you actually recommend people approach each election and the candidates in their electorate to determine who is the most deserving of their first, second and third preferences.
Yeah, so important. And the fact that we live in this democratic nation is such a privilege, and so we should never take that lightly. I don't think that the generational voting is as strong anymore. I think the next generation has been very decisive in wanting to have their own say and not necessarily what their parents say. But certainly as I grew up, that was very much the case. What I say to people is that you need to actually know what your candidates believe, and you need to know what you believe. So you need to know what's important to you. So think through the issues that really matter. The casino would be one that might come to mind. So you might think, okay, I really am opposed to people's lives being destroyed by pokies, but is that the main issue for me? Or is the main issue for me the issue of abortion? Is the issue of life and death the main issue? Or is the main issue for me marriage? Marriage is very important to me, and I want to vote for somebody who believes that marriage is between one man and one woman. So think through what your priorities and ask those people. There are very helpful guides that come out at election time, and they're from a number of different organisations, and the Australian Christian Lobby do that as well. But take the opportunity to go to the Meet Your Candidate forums that are being held, or contact each of your candidates individually. They are more than happy to answer your questions before the election, because they actually want your vote. And so even just an email, set out your questions and really carefully and prayerfully consider who you're going to vote for and who is going to be your second, because we all know the preferences really matter as well. And so it's a very important thing to take into consideration. Prioritise what is important to you, prioritise then what is important to them, and vote accordingly.
So do you recommend putting a major party first all the time? Do you buy into this notion of a wasted vote if you preference otherwise?
Not at all. So personally, I often put a minor party first that I believe is more aligned to my Christian values. It is never ever a wasted vote. So even funding, it's not even very complicated really, so you can just work it out yourself. But funding, if a minor party gets 4% of the vote, they won't necessarily win the seat. It'll be very hard to, but they will get funding to be able to continue. And the minor parties being in there with their voice, actually it does make a really big difference, because the major parties need their preferences. And so they are inclined to work with minor parties to actually facilitate them getting some of their agenda on the table, because they need their preferences. And the only way that the minor parties can continue is really by getting some funding as well. So even that 4% matters. But the more people that put number one to a minor Christian party, it's also sending a very loud message. And we've seen what minor parties are doing around our country. Yep. There are loud messages coming forward and around the globe. Yep. So we need to be part of that movement of saying, the major parties do not have all the answers, and minor parties often have very good platforms.
I think if America had preferential voting, their culture and their government would be very, very different. It's somewhat disempowering to not be able to have a second and third vote if your first choice doesn't come in. It lets you say, hey, neither of these major ones are ideal, but we're still not going to shoot ourselves in the foot, and we'll put them eventually if they're the last man standing.
I used to work in a school, and so I was the booth captain. I was the manager of the booths that were at our school, and I would see them counting out the votes in the end. And when it wasn't preferential voting, if somebody hadn't preferenced, then they just put one, and once that vote was expired, goes off the table. It just goes off the table. But when you've preferenced all the way down, then your vote stays on that table until the very end. And so your vote counts time and time again. It's actually the opposite to a wasted vote. It's the opposite.
Yeah. So not speaking for ACL now, but just for yourself, let's talk about the contentious issue of the makeup of the Senate. I think it's a fairly mainstream view that everybody wants their party to rule the government and the Senate. Do you think that's healthy for democracy, and what would you prefer to see the Senate comprised of? in an ideal world?
Yeah, so personally I don't see a major party running both houses as necessarily healthy. I think when that's happened, when there's been a party with just a huge majority, and we've seen, I personally think John Howard was one of our best prime ministers. I still have huge respect for the man. But when he had complete control of the upper house and the lower house, I think the work choices went too far. I personally think it went too far. I don't think that it should all have been thrown out. I think there were some good things in there. But this is what when one party has complete control, the debate is lost to a degree, that iron on iron. And so I think, healthy debate is really good. Yeah. When we've seen, even in our own state, when we've seen a premier have huge majority, then I think some mistakes are made because there seems to be that debate is missing.
So what about when we end up with aberrations like Clive Palmer and the Motoring Enthusiast Party elected into the Senate? How does those aberrations get resolved?
They get resolved at the next ballot. If someone like Clive Palmer or the Motoring Enthusiast Party, Ricky, if they had been amazing and really good senators and people had liked them, they would have stayed in. So we sorted out in the next ballot. I think there are aberrations because of our system, but overall, and I don't think we've got a perfect system. I don't think anyone would say that it's perfect. But overall, I think the democracy that we have is something to be prized and to be really celebrated.
Now, a slightly more nuanced, explanation or question is, tell me, there's a lot of division amongst Christians about whether we should be voting liberal left or conservative right. And the motivation for both, I believe, is pure, and that is we're looking for what's the most compassionate way we can love our neighbours.
Yeah.
Where do you see your personal preference lying, and how do you feel that's the most compassionate way to manage policy in Australia?
Look, that's a really good question, and I think as Christians, obviously, we look at the Good Samaritan, we see the compassion that Jesus calls us to, and so that compassion is something that is actually built into our DNA as Christians. Again, for me, when we're voting, I've got to look at priorities and think, okay, which party is actually best representing what I believe that Jesus would want me to be voting for. I believe that the church has a very strong responsibility to people who have come here from other countries. I think the left promote the compassion idea about our responsibility to people who have come from other countries very strongly, and in many cases very well. But I think there are times when the truth is twisted as well. So the responsibility for us is to actually get to the truth. Truth is always important.
Yes.
And so we get to the truth by actually being involved. So I would be surprised if people didn't know refugees in their own community. I would be surprised if people didn't have some way of actually finding out how they can help people who have come from other countries. Personally, I visit at the Pinkenba Refugee Centre, and I find people there who have needs, and I seek to meet them. I visit in the Darwin Detention Centre. I find people who have needs there, and I seek to meet them. I also find...
How do you do that? Is that a privileged position because of your role?
No.
Any random Joe off the street can say,
absolutely,
rock on up at, I didn't even know there was a detention facility at Pinkenba.
Okay.
I'm going to go and invite me along one day when you're going.
I will. So it's not just a simple matter of rocking up. You've got to apply, but you have to apply to go like at 24 hours before you go. They set up a process where you can go and visit with people in the centre. The centre in Pinkenba in Brisbane are mainly for people who have some sort of health issue, and they're brought to Brisbane to actually have some health care. In Darwin, it's a little bit different. It's more like a prison in Darwin and a little bit confronting, but people just love you to go and visit and sit and just talk. Some of the situations in Darwin that I've been confronted with might be that there might be a family in Darwin and there might be children in behind those bars. And that's pretty devastating to actually go and see. What I find out is that the children and the wife, the mother, are free to actually come out into the community, but the dad might not be because there might be some issue why he has to stay there for more checks and things, or there might be some flag. And so the wife and children actually choose to stay there with their husband rather than, but the government would have them come out. They have school opportunities.
It's good they've got the option to either be more comfortable or stay together.
Yeah.
It's ideal that they don't have to make a choice.
And I have people who I've met here in Australia who are now on Manus or Nauru, and I stay in contact with them over Facebook, and it's hard. It's really hard. They're not easy places to be in. And I don't think any Australian wants them to have to stay there indefinitely either. But how we work that through and how we process it, I think our government is actually trying to do the very best that they can.
So
That's been a roundabout way of answering that question, hasn't it? I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I'll drill down a bit. Is there a distinction between the policy I have as David Pellowe, follower of Jesus? I'd love an opportunity to practically love the people who are in my neighbourhood who I can meet. I'd love to come. I have visited refugees in my city and sat with them on their floor, and they've made me tea with condensed milk
food,
and chocolate for breakfast. And, you know, it was such a pleasure and privilege. They were blessed to extend hospitality.
Yes.
And, you know, that's fantastic. But I think the policy I vote for is different because I don't want my government to have unlimited hospitality, even though I want to have unlimited hospitality. Because the consequences of me, in fact, it's probably true to say I don't want to have unlimited hospitality as well. I've got wife and kids that I need to feed. I can't be infinitely generous with the cash in my pocket or the credit that I've been extended by the bank, because if I did just keep giving and giving and giving and giving, eventually my kids would miss out. And I want to love both of them, but under God, my primary obligation is to my wife and children, and to make sure they're blessed and comfortable, and very comfortable, without forgetting the opportunity to be generous to other people. So I think there's a similar dynamic, perhaps a tension, that nothing will ever be perfectly right, and the constant pull from one to the other may actually be the way to achieve the balance. But internationally, the hospitality and generosity, is there a point at which the Christian needs to vote for a government that can manage that tension and ultimately put Australia or its nation first, the people that elect it and sustain it?
I think, yeah,
do you know where I'm getting at?
I do. I think it's been interesting that both sides of major politics are really in agreement about needing to stop people getting on dangerous boats. They're in agreement over that. So these are people who are not lacking in compassion, and so, you know, there's very little difference in that way between left and right of politics. I see our politicians, our federal government, as being almost like a parent. And so my parents taught me to be compassionate to other people. My parents taught me to be kind. My parents taught me to be sharing. My parents taught me to invite people home and to take care of people. But my parents also oversaw who came. They made sure that I was safe. And they made decisions sometimes that I didn't even agree with them on, about who I would spend time with and which friends would come. So I guess I see the Australian federal government as being that parent, knowing more than we know sometimes. One thing I would really love is that we shifted our focus to what happens when people come here in the boats, that these people could be me. If I was in a country where my children were not going to have a future, if I was feeling pressed or my children were feeling persecuted, I could very well get on one of those boats, Dave.
Yeah.
I really could.
Yeah.
What I would prefer is that we shifted our focus to what happens when they get here, to why are we not using our money best in those countries and actually doing something there on the front line and helping right there in the camps or before they even get to the camps.
I think that's a more classic conservative perspective, is to look at the long-term consequences as well as the long-term history and say, how can we not just solve the problem, but actually prevent the problem?
Exactly. It's the whole top of the cliff thing, isn't it? Rather than the ambulance down the bottom, stopping people from actually falling over in the first place.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.